Hi, everyone. Right, hi, Rick. Right, so we can now actually officially get started. It is now, well, from my point of view, 7 o'clock, and it's something else o'clock elsewhere. I was just looking to see if there was anything interesting. I've noted, like on MMO Champion, there's what might, under normal circumstances, be an interesting post about the Netherlight Crucible, which has received a blue response. Unfortunately, it's on the European servers, which means that there will be no blue response of note. And yes, sure enough, it's just something saying, will the Netherlight Crucible work with our relics? Response, yes it will. I'm sure there are more intelligent questions that can be answered on the forums. Why do they only... I suppose they only ever answer the really obvious ones because it's the only one that they choose to do. As a professor, I'm not that level. I don't teach at that level. I have no idea. I mean, your main job as a professor at university surely is research. And I can tell you what not to do, but I'm sure you've got the same stories as I have. You know, when you went to university yourself, that there would have been very good teachers, very good lecturers, as we would call them, because the word professor means different things in different countries. In the UK, for example, a professor is a super serious lecturer, senior. They're the head of a research group. The other ones are just called lecturers. And, you can tell which ones were good and which ones were bad. So I haven't seen any new news. I haven't seen any new updates apart from the hotfix. They finally sort of announced the Fallen Avatar hotfixes for Mythic, which they'd had at first. Your first day at uni, you are still sober? What's going on? I don't remember my first day at uni. I remember my first day going to lectures, which was not the first day of uni. Because they understood, well, especially in Britain, they understand that you're not going to be upright for your first week of uni. So they give you what's called Freshers' Week. And then they expect you to turn up to lectures the following week. And in my first day, it was in the School of Physics. There's huge lecture. There's several lecture theatres, some of them for niche subjects, but there was one really big one because, to accommodate, there were 200 of us on the sort of main course, so we needed a big lecture theatre for that. And I wandered into a lecture, not the first lecture of the day, the second lecture of the day, and sat down in the middle of it all, and they were doing electromagnetism, and I was part way through and I thought, I don't understand this. This is over my head. And then at one point, halfway through, the lecturer talked about work we'd done last year. And I thought, this is a second year lecture. I'm in the wrong place. And it turns out that I was, and that all the first years were supposed to be in the chemistry building at that particular time, where I was not. And at that time, you can't just suddenly, halfway through a lecture, stand up and walk out. You will attract attention. So I just sat there and just put up with it. Economics, dear me. So you can find out what happened to all the money that suddenly disappeared off the face of the earth. But, right, well, we are all working, so this is good. Right, so it was actually quite good, the chemistry lecture theatre, though. It had fantastic boards. But we had a lunatic in charge of them. They had, like in the physics theatre, it just had blackboards across. Whereas in the chemistry one, they had them on runners. So the lecturer could pull down a board, write on it, and then he could throw it up away somewhere. It was huge. There was loads of them. They're all on little runners and casters. But we had a lunatic who taught there, because I went there the second week, a week behind already. And he was doing statistics. And he would scribble on a board. And then he'd fling it away up into some distant corner and start scribbling on another one. You'd have to try... He didn't number them or anything. You had to keep track of them. Copy it down. You didn't have time to even think about it. You just copied it down furiously. We didn't have mobile... Well, you had mobile phones then, but they didn't have cameras in them. So you couldn't just sort of film the thing. And that's what they do now. That's what my students do. I was doing a lesson on ethics today. And, they were just... you need to make notes here. Oh, that's all right. I've got my phone. I'll just take a photo of this. Good. No, 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 no. At some point, someone will discover it because they always do. But I don't try to encourage them to have anything to do with me. Outside of college, that is. So, but yeah, at some point, some nosy sod will look me up. Well, I'm lazier, or, I mean, I don't know. Lazy or just more innovative, I suppose. I don't, I'm not one of those who moans about sort of modern world. In fact, I actually think like education nowadays isn't keeping up with the times. I mean, we have this ridiculous situation with exams where we expect them to memorize facts still. We do all this work to try and prevent them going into exams with phones and all the rest of it. And it's like, why? Because it used to be the case when I taught maths. I mean, arithmetic is important for people who want to do high-level maths, but for everyone else, it's not. The argument used to be, well, you won't have your calculator in the supermarket, will you? To which now they would just say, yes, I've got it in my pocket. And that's true. So what's the point? And the same thing with looking up facts. They just look them up. I mean, we were doing a discussion today on... and I gave one group an ethical a discussion on on trees against cancer cures against conservation, and it involved a tree, and he was looking up this tree, and it's what type it was, where it's found in the world, and stuff like that on his phone. Absolutely fine, extra research, nice and easy, quick and easy to do. Exactly, yeah. I mean, that's the thing. The answer's just out there. Whether you trust them is another matter. I mean, that's the thing we should be teaching them, not to not use the internet. We should be teaching them, can you trust the source? Because just because the internet says so doesn't mean it's true. Just because anyone says so doesn't mean it's true. So you have to consider the source. How many places have you found the same thing? Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah. And in some exams, like high-level maths exams, you are allowed to use programmable calculators. But I'm sort of more for the lower level ones where arithmetic is... Because at that level, arithmetic. You don't need to be tested on that anymore. You know it. So there are higher level stuff which you can. Even though, I mean, I could moan about it because when I was doing those sort of exams, we didn't have those programmable calculators, sorry. They were very expensive. They sort of existed. They were very crap and very expensive. So they weren't in common use. So we had to work out graphs by hand and stuff like that. But well, Scandinavian countries are a bit more enlightened when it comes to education. They've got some brains. In Britain, it's all an absolute. There's no one who knows what they're doing. Yes, yes. You sound like one of my students, Arrested Pie. Then, using your graphical calculator to draw pictures. I suppose you were one of those people with a normal calculator who used to write boobies on it, weren't you? But anyway. Shall we get on to World of Warcraft then? So, 7.3. One thing that caught me out by surprise yesterday, I was not expecting this, because Blizzard again said, and it's the way it seemed to work out on PTR, was we get our artifact knowledge automatically, which is true, and we get it every week. Well, I got another artifact knowledge point yesterday. So I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute. At first I was thinking, so it used to be every 5 days that you could put your new artifact knowledge on. And this is 5 days later because we got, with the reset last week for me in Europe was Wednesday. So that is 5 days later getting it on Monday. But the thing that alerted me to the fact that I got it on Monday was not me suddenly noticing. I didn't notice at all. I wasn't even looking. It was an American on Discord saying, oh, I've got the artifact knowledge. So from an American's point of view, that would be 6 days later, wouldn't it? Because they would have gotten theirs on Tuesday. So I don't actually know what's going on. Are we getting it every 5 days? Is this an aberration? I don't understand anymore. I mean, I wouldn't complain if it's now going to be every 5, but it's not. But that wasn't a 5 day interval for Americans. Yeah, I don't. Well, it's just the fact that someone said yesterday. I didn't see anyone saying it on Sunday. So, but I don't know. It's weird. It is very, very odd. So I now don't know when we're getting... So do we get the next artifact knowledge I mean, if we got it yesterday, does that mean on Saturday? Or is it just going to be every Monday? So it keeps it the same the world over. Again, why don't Blizzard answer questions like that? Instead of, will our relics slot into the Netherlight Crucible? Yes, this whole thing is designed for you to put relics in. Yes, your relics will slot into it. There wasn't even a hint of sarcasm in the answer to that post. So why don't they answer a question like that? Someone asked that question. When are we getting our artifact knowledge? Because that is actually fairly important. To which it turns out I am very behind, by the way. I've got to do some catching up. I've got no. We've now started to set a minimum requirement in our guild, which I will not meet for next week because I'm far too busy. Another reason why I'm a little bit annoyed that the patch didn't come out before I had to go back to work, because then I would have had time to do that. I mean, technically, I had time to get up a bit further over summer, you could argue, but I always seem to have things to do. It may be, yes, Maximus, that they just want to have a set date for EU and NA, in which case it becomes maybe every Monday, and that's the thing. Or maybe it was always intended to be every 5 days as it was before, and it was just a slip of the tongue, someone saying automatically every week. Because technically it would be automatically every week, it's just some weeks you would get to. We've got a week, yes, we've got... I'm not sure what the weekly goal is, but we have got, we're supposed to have 63 by a week tomorrow. You know, not tomorrow's reset, but the reset a week later. I've only just got 61, so I don't think so. In theory, that would, you could get 2 in that time, especially as we've just got an artifact knowledge point now, and we'd get another one. Well, we either get another one on Saturday, in which case that's much more straightforward, or we get one on Monday, in which case that's still a couple of days. But in reality, like tonight, I've come home only just in time for this, for example, and I've managed to do a few world quests. Afterwards, I will do some more, and I will try. Obviously, you try and prioritize the ones on Argus for rep, if nothing else. My rep's going to go far behind. There's going to come a point at which we're going to expect everyone to rune as well. So instead of, like I was advising people to sell their defiled augment runes while it's still worth something, I'm keeping mine because I am never going to get exalted before most of the rest of the guild. So, because I can't do all the world quests every day, I don't have time now that I'm back at work. So I'm keeping my stock and hoping that actually the arse does crash out the market and I can buy a load cheaply as well. So let's have a look. Well, you say you definitely can. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of people who can if you've got the time to do it. I think some people who do a lot sometimes underestimate how much time they're actually spending doing it. When it comes down to it. Some people just think, oh, I only do a little bit now and then, when in actual fact, they're actually doing it a lot. Well, you say that. Whether you need it or not, having more power means you have a large margin for error. So, although our gear is good enough to do the last 2 bosses, at the moment we are not, because we haven't killed them. And having better gear just helps. It's a bit like, at the moment we're on Avatar, Fallen Avatar. So, the key DPS check to make on Fallen Avatar in Phase 1, there's, I suppose, 2. One is making sure you can break the shield. Now, in an effort to break the shield, people will risk things if it's difficult. If it's a tight DPS check, people will risk things, and then mistakes will be made and people will die and you wipe. Whereas if it's an easy DPS check, if the raid leader is able to say, we can easily make this check, we don't even need everyone to DPS, then the emphasis is on people to do the mechanics properly and not worry about the DPS. But that is not the situation for us at the moment. It is quite tight. We don't always make that check. Apart from anything else, I'm always soaking a pylon because we don't have enough range. So I was soaking a pylon last night, for those who watched me stream that. So I've got no chance of doing any damage to the Maiden when the shield goes up. So, but if you've got suddenly more power, then you get yourself to a situation where we can easily make that check. Don't worry about DPS, worry about mechanics. At that point, the only people that will cock it up for you are the DPS whores. Everyone else will go, okay, mechanics, yeah, sure. And they'll focus entirely on the mechanics and it'll get done. So yeah, it just gives you that larger margin for error. It also means in a phase you don't have to go as far in sometimes if it's percentage based like Avatar. You know, you want to get the 4 beams, I do, don't you, on that, to get his health down as low as possible for phase 2. And then, of course, phase 2 is a huge DPS race. You know, kill it before you run out of platform. So, even given that there's extra mechanics on there, it's still a huge DPS race. Oh, yeah, Moonwire, I absolutely agree that the more comfortable you feel. But the problem is, at the moment, we're the sort of guild that we will take many more pulls than guilds much higher up, obviously, because we're still there. But the reason for that is because, like, my attitude is always learn the mechanics first, then when you fail a DPS check, then work on the DPS. A lot of people don't. They have it in their heads that they need to, like, when that maiden shield needs breaking, that's their thinking. It's like they can only think of one thing at a time, and it's DPS. But at the same time, you've got other things going off as well. We have people, for example, who keep cocking up the uncontrolled, like the uncontrolled chaos, whatever it's called. For the way we do it, at the boss. Yeah, at the boss. Not just in melee range of the boss, at the boss. And then you can do your move round, back, not even at a melee range, back round, circly thing. People don't do that. So we're constantly moving backwards into someone else's bloody chaos. And either taking big hits or dying. Because people can't even get it into their pigeon brains that you need to be at the boss at that time if there's something else to do. We have a huge amount of melee. Like, we have so many melee last night that I had to soak a pylon. I was ranged. I mean, generally speaking, I wouldn't even be in. We had a few people off with work yesterday. We really need more ranged. In fact, it's not helped by the fact, I mean, effectively we lost 2 ranged, 4 last night, that is, not completely. One of which is our Shadow Priest, who went holy to cover for our actual healing priest, who's gone on holiday at the moment. And our raid leader, Boomkin, who also has a geared rogue, so was using that for soaks. Now, it's nice that there's only 4 touches now, but we only have 2 main spec rogues. So we were using, so by Boomkin going rogue, we had 3 rogues, plus a demon hunter who can soak everyone as well. Yeah, the bracers, I wouldn't recommend the bracers. There should be, I mean, I do take divine intervention, I have to confess. But that's not because there's anything in the fight that ought to, it's just that it's a fight where some other people can kill you. You know, so I do still take divine intervention purely because it's progress. If once people start doing the mechanics properly, actually, I'll say at that point, I'm not expecting to be in. It's my job at the moment to try and recruit so that I don't have to be in on it, because I really don't. I feel so ridiculous on it. That's like do nothing. It's not that Ret Paladins can't do it. I mean, obviously some Ret Paladins have killed it, quite a few now, but there's nothing to do on it. Anything you can do can be done better by others. I'm not saying everyone else, but there's other classes that can do it better. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the further you go on, there will be people that do it with more. I mean, how many did we have yesterday? We had 2 warriors. There was me. There was a Death Knight. So that's 4 plate melee straight away. 3 rogues. Can't count now. 7. Demon Hunter. So we had 8 melee yesterday. Was that right? I think that's right. Oh, and an enhancement shamer. Sorry, 9. Okay. Now I replaced a feral druid, so it would still be 9 even if that feral druid was there. He'd just replaced me. Doesn't the brace allow you to not run away from the boss? Yeah, sure. Once every 3 minutes. That effect happens loads of times. I'm not sure that it's really worth doing it for that. When you've got a cheat death, I think it's much better using it. And that's also assuming it doesn't do so much damage that it still kills you anyway. But I don't think it would. If you're talking about the realities thing, what's it called? Twisted Realities or something. I only have a vague recollection of the names of abilities. I usually just remember them in terms of what visually they look like and what they do. Also, yes, as you quite rightly said, it'll tax the healers as well. There's enough stupid damage going out as it is, as well as necessary damage, and it is indeed a 3-minute cooldown. So, yeah, it's rupturing realities, thank you. There we go. Have I done any PT practice? Yeah, plenty. The one good thing about the fight for progress is you get onto P2 every time. Unless, of course, the raid leader tells us to die before he drops down to save time. So, obviously, in the early pulls, when we were going down, we decided to have a bit of P2 practice anyway. But yeah, at the moment, we are not yet getting to the point where we want to go into P2. Holy wrath. Behave. So yeah, we haven't had that much time on it. What have we had? 2 full nights on it. And we're going to take it. If you think, and it's, I know the first guilds that killed it, several hundred wipes, 400 wipes, 450, whatever it was. And you can say, well, yeah, but we've got better gear than that now, so it shouldn't be as many. We're also a lot stupider than they are. So I'm pretty sure it will still be at least that many, if not more. When I think about how many pulls it took to get Mistress down, and then Maiden of Vigilance, I was quite pleased we actually killed Maiden of Vigilance quite quickly on the re-kill this week. Because it's only the second week, this reset. Like, if you're in North America, you're wondering what I'm talking about because you're in the new reset. But in terms of me, I'm still in last week's reset. So it was only the re-kill this week. We actually killed it quite quickly. It didn't take that many pulls. But, the first few pulls were deaths within 10 seconds. It was like, dead, 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 dead. Oh, we killed it. Okay. It's really weird. And I think it just sort of proves how people's mindset is if they focus on mechanics, because we have never yet wiped after the second blowback. Every time we get to the second blowback, we kill the boss. Now, I know it's not a large sample size. We've only done it twice. But we've only gotten to the second blowback twice as well. And I think it's because at that point, people know all they have to do is not cock up and the boss will die. So they behave themselves then. Whereas at the start of the fight, they don't know it's going to be a kill. So they risk a bit in order to get high on ranks on meters. Like, and same thing on Avatar. You've got people who are ultimately just trying to do what's best for their damage on meters. And it cocks it. Maiden, Avatar, those sort of fights are really good for screwing everyone else over. You could just wipe the raid with one thoughtless action. Well, that is the key thing, meanwhile. This mechanics greater than DPS thing. There's too many people who will say it. Like everyone we interview, when we talk about this is one question we ask, about the mechanics versus DPS thing. In fact, this is a laugh for you. Not naming names, obviously, but we recruited someone at the weekend. They're not joining us now, but this was hilarious. So I brought up this subject about mechanics, DPS versus mechanics. And he gave the answer that everyone else will, and I hammered this point home. They always say, oh yeah, I always do mechanics over my personal DPS. Everyone says that. Well, not everyone does it. In many guilds in my position, no, you don't. If you had people who did mechanics over DPS, you wouldn't be in our position. You'd be much higher up. So this guy was saying exactly the same thing, and I was really hammering the point home that, because we've had this a couple of times, we had someone leave quite recently because they weren't doing the mechanics properly. They were dying to stuff or cocking stuff up too much, like not once or twice, a lot, like they were doing all night. So we benched them for progress, and they didn't like that. They left. So I was trying to explain to this person, this is what would happen to them. It doesn't matter how good their damage is. If they are costing us, then they will be benched. And they said they were all fine with that. Then apparently they they contacted another officer to say, oh, they're not going to be joining us after all. It looks like our raiders are a load of rubbish. This was actually quite hilarious. So this officer asked a few follow-up questions. Oh, what are you talking about? Which raiders? Two of the raiders, because they'd looked through our logs from this week's reclear, like the Wednesday logs. Two of the raiders that they were slating included my rogue. So my shitty rogue, I don't even know how to play properly. Because it was in on the first 5 kills of the Mythic to get some gear, he was saying, that's Shadowken. It's a load of rubbish. I'm not joining any guild with that cretin. And he also picked on someone else who was also taking their out through to try and get some loot. And also he was picking on a couple of people because he was saying, oh, their DPS is quite low. But it was quite low on Mistress they were talking about, where it's supposed to be low because we leave the ads alone. So they're focusing on the boss. So they're doing what they're supposed to be doing to kill the boss. They're actually doing a good job. And anyone who can actually read logs properly would see that. But they were just looking at, oh, those numbers aren't very good at all. They were just looking at the front page, which has the percentiles, and going, oh, no. But the curious thing was, those logs were no different to the previous weeks. And the thing he wrote on the application was, you know, in terms of why do you want to join our guild, been looking through your logs and your raiders look really good. So I mean, sometimes when it comes to executing mechanics, the very tough bosses, of course, have pressures put on you. It's not just, you know, and some people struggle to prioritize it because sometimes you can't just say, okay, this mechanic's coming up, I need to focus 100% on that. Because there might be another mechanic and you can't do it 100%. You've got to do that as well. It's like you've got to do two things. And some people just either don't prioritize or they don't think quickly enough about a situation that may not happen every time. Like the daggers is a classic example of this on Avatar. There are certain times when getting the daggers is not a problem. You just move to a fairly sensible position. Sometimes you can get daggers either from a bad place, like from the back if you're melee on the other side or something like that, or you could get them at a really bad time. Like I kept getting them on pulls yesterday, or a lot of the time, when I'm just about to soak a pylon, but not actually soaking the pylon. If I was already soaking the pylon, it's just like, well, it's going to hit me where it hits me, because I've got to soak this pylon. But if it's just before, you then think to yourself, I can get to the side quickly, drop it there, and then get back there. So sometimes you have to try and think for yourself, and you might not have come across this situation. You could easily have someone who didn't get a daggers in a bad spot all last night, and then maybe they'll get it a couple of times in the next raid we do it on. And, you know, maybe they'll make a wrong decision. So, you know, sometimes you can have people, and if they have to experience it themselves, you need so many pulls to get everyone to experience it, because there's so many different variations of who can get it and when. And then I'm not even looking at Killjade at the moment. Not even looking. I'll look at that later when we're getting close on Avatar. I think, because I think the way it seems to work, even when you get in to phase 2 at a reasonable point, guilds still seem to take quite a while to kill it. So I think that's the point where you probably look at Killjade. Yes, meanwhile, I absolutely agree with that. You do want people who can think about the situations that might happen, because, you know, you get some mechanics that are on a timer, and then sometimes the timers merge. Sometimes you get mechanics based on a timer and some on a percentage, like a Mistress, and sometimes just changing your DPS. Like that nerf, for example, didn't actually help us on Mistress this week or last week because it threw our timings out. Rhett is really strong on Killjade, and I don't even know whether you're trolling me or not. It might be now. It certainly wasn't at the time, was it? Actually, man, yeah, well, I was going to do a vlog on this at some point. I'm not worried about mythic mechanics being punishing. They should be punishing. But this idea of the only punishment being death is very uninspiring. You know, there's other penalties they could apply. If someone cocks something up, there's other things they could do, and they don't seem to do that. But yeah, I mean, the last two bosses, I don't like it when you have fights. I mean, this is more for Avatar, really. Towards the end of a raid tier, where it encourages class stacking. Because if it was earlier on in the fight, the better guilds would just burn through it, and it's not a big deal. A Mistress fight would be much better for the penultimate fight, because the mechanics of that are much better. You don't have to class stack. You just have to deal with the mechanics properly. And you just have to focus mechanics over DPS. And that's how you do Mistress. But also, there is that tight DPS check as well. So it's like you have to do DPS and mechanics. So that's fine. Because Avatar is basically like, well, it was at the time, and now it's more sort of, have you got like a load of rogues? No. Oh dear. And also, you know, guilds, I think, like us, even though it's possible, obviously it's possible, others have done it. But you make it much, much more difficult if you have a high proportion of melee in your roster. And let's face it, most guilds, unless, like, there are some guilds who can say, right, do you know what, we need a mage now, and they'll go out and get a mage. We can't do that. We have to just get good players of whatever classes are available. There are obviously classes we would prefer to get, but we are not able to just go out and get whatever we want. So, in that scenario, and a guild in our position would have been able to do that a couple of years ago, but now, no. Or even a bit over a year ago, but now, no. But this shouldn't. But yeah, but Mistress doesn't have that. It doesn't. You don't need several of those classes to be really good. And it wasn't a big problem to have a fair number of melee as well. You still didn't want lots of melee. But loads of people have loads of melee because there's more melee classes. There's 9 out of 12 DPS classes have a melee spec. 6 of which have to be melee. If you're going to be DPS, there's 6 classes you're melee. That's all there is to it. You've got no choice in the matter. 3 of them where you get a choice. And then there's only 3 classes that have to be ranged. It's total imbalance. It wouldn't matter if the imbalance was the other way. If the imbalance was having more ranged classes. Because range, like, there's very few fights where you suffer from having too many ranged. I mean, Gul'dan was 1. But mostly, if you're going to have an imbalance of melee or range, you'd rather have an imbalance of range. On almost every raid boss there has ever been. I mean, I remember even in vanilla, in Molten Core, there's quite a lot of fights where being melee was a bit of a problem. Maiden, yeah, well, actually Maiden, to be fair, is one of those where you want a nice balance. You don't want too much of anything. But yeah, if you have slightly too much melee, there is an issue there. The way I know it's not the way everyone does it. Some people actually get the raid lead to call out assignments. We don't. We use a weak aura. We had to amend the weak aura that came from Fat Boss, I think. We had to amend it because the problem with the weak aura, it assumes your shaman is enhancement, which ours is, so that's fine. We don't have an elemental shaman. And it also assumes that your druid is a boomkin. Well, we have a feral druid, so we had to take him off the list. And then he just charges ahead and nicks all my orbs. But if you have too many melee, which we did the first few pulls we had on it, so sometimes you'll get assigned as a melee to go the wrong side and soak, and it's like, so you're asking me to hang back in ranged, basically. Don't really fancy doing that. So yeah, we have to try and just have the right number for that. More tanking options. Yes, well, tanking is a really strange situation as well, because for DPS, let's say you've got a fight. I'm not even going to say rogue. Hi, Clifardio. I'm fine, thank you. Let's say you've got a rogue. No, not rogue. Let's think of something else. So, who else can do something useful? Let's talk about Shadow Priests in, say, we'll go back to the last expansion. So, Priests mind controlling the ads on Blast Furnace. So, there was a situation that was useful to bring Priests. Then, let's say the next fight, Priests are terrible. So, you don't take them. You sort of have that option. It's not very nice for the Priests themselves, it's the class's fault, not theirs. But nonetheless, a guild has the option because you've got more DPS than you need. So you swap them for the more useful classes who were benched on that Blast Furnace fight. With tanks, you don't really get to do that. Tanks aren't used to being part of a team where they could be benched. So the way a lot of tanks get around it is to play multiple tanking specs. And in the best guilds, and I don't mean best as in the hardcore guilds, but in the best, even like just decent cutting edge guilds, you will cover most of the tanking specs by having each of your 2 tanks being able to play at least 2 classes and keeping them up to date with gear and stuff like that. So that does tend to be a thing, because usually tanks are so dedicated at being tanks that whenever they play another spec, when they have an alt, that tanks as well. It's very uncommon, in my experience anyway, to see tank players play another role, even with their alts. It's always like, no tank, you know. And then one day, one of them rolls a warlock and goes, what do I do with this? Where's my taunt? Oh, Voidwalker, that'll do. Oh, I can be tank now. Because they just only think about tanking. But it is, yes, it is annoying, because tanks as well, like healers, are very distinctive. Healers, you get away with it, because although you have 6 healing specs and all of them have their strengths and weaknesses, you can have 6 healers in a roster and therefore take the ones that are going to be better. Best combination for different fights. But tanks, you've got all 6 tanks and they all have their strengths and weaknesses. But very few guilds can actually call on the services of whichever classes happen to be best. So that's another one where if on a particular tier, the tank specs that are best for that tier you happen to have in your roster, great, you'll do better. That'll gain you 100 ranks or something maybe. And if you don't have them, let's say you have the worst ones, you're in bother. You're in dead lumber, in fact. And you need those tanks to be absolutely on the money, great players. And that's not always the case. Having tanks ready for progress, massive help for a guild, of course. Yes, it is, absolutely. Because it gives you those options. Like Blizzard keeps saying, when Blizzard changed the hard mode to a fixed size of 20 man, when that whole 10 versus 25 man nonsense was over, they said the argument was so that they could design encounters without having to think, oh, but would a 10-man guild have that? So it's, in other words, they're saying to design encounters on the assumption that everyone has access to every class and spec. Well, that doesn't work for 20 man. There are 36 specs in the game. No Mythic guild has a roster of 36. And even if you accept that some of those are pure DPS classes, so you should expect them to be able to at least play a couple of them, it still comes down to way over the expected roster size of about 25. I mean, 25 is a good number. You don't really want much more than that, because if your raiders are reliable, I mean, ours aren't. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's generally not a good thing. But it does at least mean we're not having every night 5 people on the bench. But if you have reliable raiders and you have a roster of 25, because you still need roughly that just to cover the specs and the classes, then that means you've got 5 people on the bench every night. Well, that's a bit crap for Mythic Raiders. So it just seems to me there's no long-term thinking between like class design and raid encounter design again. Yes, not just this tier, meanwhile, like there's plenty of tiers. I remember in WoD at the end of Blackrock Foundry, we were struggling on Iron Maidens. Sure, we would have killed it eventually, but we were struggling on it. We had 2 shield tanks. We had a Paladin and a Warrior tank. The Warrior tank, we geared up his Brewmaster. So then we took his Brewmaster, once it was ready, it didn't take that long, took it onto Iron Maidens, killed it, no time. Because it was totally able to cheese a mechanic there. And then carried on and used it on Blackrock, on Blackhand as well, where you were able to cheese phase 2 by face tanking the tank, the actual machine. So, whereas if we'd have persisted with a Warrior and Paladin tank, it would have taken us a lot longer. And indeed, it was taking us a while until we were able to gear up that Brewmaster, because it wasn't an overnight thing. So, and there's always been situations like this. I remember way back in vanilla, in original Nax, Now, the guild I was in, basically they just completely stopped raiding as soon as TBC was announced. So when the date was announced. So 2 months before it came out, when it was announced, they just basically said, what's the point? We're just going to be upgrading our epics with greens because they were just loot whores. So that was a bit crap. So we hadn't finished Naxxramas. We were on to Goth. We'd almost killed Gothic. We hadn't quite killed Gothic. But what would be the next fight? 4 horsemen. What do you need on 4 horsemen? 8 tanks. 8 warrior tanks. Well, no roster at the time had 8 warrior tanks. You might have had 6 if you were, you know, most rosters would have about 6. So you needed a couple more at least. So we tried to gear up some alts for that specifically. And they were lazy beggars. They didn't really want to do anything. But the fact that even then you had to do these stupid things with, you know, if you had the capacity to do that, if you had, as well as a roster of however many main warrior tanks, also some alts to do it, what was happening? I can't remember the details because I never did the fight, but every single one of the bosses needed tanking separately, and there were 4 of them, hence 4 horsemen, and there needed to be tank swaps, is how I think it worked. But I can't say for certain because I never got up to that fight. Whereas when Naxxramas came out tier 7 style, it was ridiculously simple. Yeah. And that was something that should never have been done. That was you know, Blizzard should have realised that the average roster, because warriors were the only tank, there was no other warrior tank. Sorry, no other tank class. Paladin and druids, the problem with it is, first of all, the mechanics were primitive. You could sort of do it, but I didn't have a taunt, which made it tricky. Not impossible. I mean, I tanked some raid bosses as a paladin, but the main thing is all your tier gear with your set bonuses, very powerful set bonuses. The only one who had tanking set bonuses were warriors. Their gear had tank set bonuses on, and paladins and druids didn't. So, yes. It was generally okay, because once you'd got threat, it took you a little while to get threat though, because you had no taunt. And you imagine what it was like with the warriors. Oh, wait for like 2 sunders or 3 sunders or whatever. We didn't have sunders. I mean, to begin with, before we got Righteous Fury, because that was in the good old patch 1.9, I still remember it to this day, because that is the day when they introduced some much more sensible paladin abilities. But before patch 1.9, you had something called Seal of Fury. Exactly, Maximus. Seal of Fury, which was a seal you had which did more threat. So one of my tanking jobs on Major Domo Executors was to take one of the elites along a wall and just hit it. And that would be the last one we killed. So by the time we got to it, I'd have generated enough threat. It wasn't very good taunt. No, a taunt doesn't matter how much threat anyone's got on it. If you taunt something, it will attack you. Seal of Fury wouldn't do that. It just generated extra threat. Netherlight Crucible doesn't come out this week. It comes out next week. It's the 3rd week. So in North America, that would be the 12th and the 13th in EU. I don't know where the 17th is coming from. That's a Sunday. It's not coming out then. But it is next week in 7 or 8 days' time, depending on which region you are in. I mean, there were some useful jobs for paladin tanks, but it mostly involved either tanking the imps or the core hounds because of consecration, because that was a massively beneficial AoE threat generator. Did very little damage, but it caused a lot of threat. So you could just go into the imps before the first boss, or the core hounds before the second, and drop a consecrate and gather them all up. And then, as I say, tanking elites on Major Domo. If it was the 9th, I'd be in trouble because I've only just sent off my dad's birthday card and it's his birthday on the 7th. If they gave you time, it would. Seal of Fury and Consecration were fine if you had time. But it's not like now. Like, if you try to do it with today's attitude towards tanks. Today's attitude towards tanks is you don't have to wait for the tank. As soon as they've pulled, you expect that they've got enough threat on it. You don't even wait. Mana, I mean, it depends what you used. Because there was no need to judge, for example, when using Seal of Fury. Really. You judged Crusader, but you only needed to keep that active for every half a minute. Just for the extra holy power. Holy damage. Then you Seal of Fury, then Consecration. It was. I sort of felt it was okay on mana. Obviously, when you're raiding, you've got access to mana regen items, which could help. But again, for tanking gear, what would you use? You would use the blue crafted gear, which I can't even make anymore, annoyingly, because you can't get the patterns anymore. I had them on my Paladin. I had quite a lot of blacksmithy patterns that you can't get anymore. But do you know, I think I might even still have the macro. There was a macro you used to sort of tell if you were uncrushable. This was more for TBC when it was possible. I might even still have it somewhere. I probably don't. I probably deleted it now. But I never know. I might have a look at that. But warriors were... I mean, they had better tools and also they had the gear. We didn't have the gear. Regardless. The best thing there was in the protection paladin tree, apart from reckoning, was a 15-minute blessing of salvation. At a time when blessings lasted 5 minutes. And you had to do them on individual people. But then good old patch 1.9 where you had blessings that would work on everyone of that class and they lasted 15 minutes. And then they increased it to 30 minutes and then eventually 60 minutes, didn't they? But I mean, later on I tanked a few things. I main tanked a Nixia later on. But that's at the point at which you outgear it. You know, you wouldn't do it for progress. That'd be asking for trouble. Didn't have to stance because we had a dwarf priest who could just put fear ward on me. I mean, yeah, but that's just them acting as a meat shield on patchwork. All you needed was someone to have a load of health. You know, more health than the DPS that were there. That's what you needed of your... Like, of some of the tanks on patchwork. You just needed someone, yeah, to take the hateful strike. But, I don't think we used druid tanks then, though. We did use... One of our druids fancied tanking something, but I can't remember what it was now. I'm sure it was something in Blackwing Lair. It may have even just been their Draconid trash. After Firemore, I don't know. Seemed to one of them quite liked doing it when they could. Scarum. I don't even... I remember the boss in the fight. I don't remember doing it, though. That's one of the very... The main fights I remember in AQ Forge, I remember Cthulhu quite a lot. How did we kill in Nax 40? We did... all of them apart from Viscodus and Uro. So the two of the options, there were three like optional bosses. There was the Triumvirate, which we did do because you could make that either easy or difficult depending on the order you killed them. But the other optional bosses, Uro and Viscodus, we didn't bother. Mostly because our raid leader couldn't be asked with what he was only bothered about getting like the world ranks, getting the last boss killed. So we often didn't bother with optional ones. And we didn't bother with those two at all. Which is a bit of a shame, because they dropped, both of them dropped items I wanted. Which I've since got, but just for transmog now. So yeah, it was all the main ones, plus... and before Nax came out as well, we did it in time. But we didn't do those two optional bosses. I don't think we even did attempts on Viscodus. We did literally 2 hours on Uro. Because there was another guild on our server that we heard that was doing it. And as much as he wanted to focus on just killing Cthulhu, he also didn't fancy the idea of anyone on our server killing a boss before we did. But we literally did 2 hours on it, and then the next day we found out they'd killed it, so it was like, well, there's no point, who cares now? So we then stopped. But it was a bit of a shame. It was quite a nice fight as well. I quite liked it. But a lot didn't. But I remember Cthulhu quite seriously because it was probably one of the only fights before Nax that really understood how to deal with 40 people. Because most bosses, it was like, oh, you know, kill 20 of them, doesn't matter. On Cthulhu, you did need people to live because there was one particular phase quite early on where you were in groups of, like, in party groups, basically, around the boss. And you had tentacles that you had to kill quite quickly. And if someone died, then you probably wouldn't have had enough DPS to kill them. And then they would kill the rest of your group. And then... Oh, sorry, Nax. I like talking about AQ. In Nax, we did everything up to Gothic. So that would be however many bosses there are, -3. I think. Are there 13 bosses altogether? However many there are. We didn't kill Horse... No, actually, no. -4. I was thinking we'd kill Gothic. We haven't killed... We nearly killed Gothic. We're so close. There was one try when we absolutely should have killed him. We were so close. But that was basically the last raid we ever did. Because TBC was announced and it was like, it can't be asked. So, yeah, sorry. So we didn't quite kill Gothic. Annoying. I don't know why they didn't at least just finish that off. We didn't do 4 Horsemen. And obviously we didn't do Saffron or Kel'Thuzad because you can't even get to those. Well, the first time you do Cthulhu, obviously everyone just wipes the beam. Because it takes a certain amount of practice just to get into that room without doing that. But yeah, then, so you've got these tentacles, and if they kill one person, you might not have enough DPS to kill them. Then they kill everyone else. Then they're going to start to kill people on the groups either side who are dealing with their own tentacles, and the whole thing just spreads from there. So you really need people to live at least through that bit. And then every now and then, you know, you'd be moving away from his I-beam when he does the rotating around the room, the death glare type thing. And you get things spawn up that either might knock you back into the beam. It was all right for me. As soon as that happened, it would just bubble. Or would, like, wing clip you. So you're sort of, you know, slowed. Again, paladins can deal with that fairly straightforward. But for a lot of people, that was a bit of a problem. The best thing about Cthulhu, though, was the trash before it, which for everyone else was a nightmare, but for me was quite good, because it would occasionally mind control people. And we used to have things, you can still see it in add-ons now, can't you? Main assist. Because there's no need for a main assist these days. But at the time there was. So if you've got a load of trash with very dangerous, you can't just randomly AoE it all down, so you've got to focus priority targets. So you'd use a hunter who'd be the main assist. They would take get the next target. You would click on them on the raid frame's main assist. That's your next DPS target. And I put him up to, whenever anyone was mind controlled, if it was a gnome, to target them. So then everyone would just, without thinking, burst down the gnome. I say without thinking. I think people probably knew what was going on. The Lucid Nightmare mount, no, I haven't. The thing is, at the moment, like, I don't really have time. I'm not a mount collector. You know, so I don't put that much effort into collecting mounts. And apparently this one is going to take a lot of effort. And at the moment, you know, the time is such that I need to just focus on, when I'm in game, trying to do stuff that's going to be useful for raiding. At the moment, I'm trying to try and get a load of artifact power for a start. So at some point, maybe I'll get around to it. I'm not even keen on the mount, though. I think the most appealing thing about it is it's just one of those things that maybe it is an ugly mount. It's just it's an evil unicorn, you know. So it might be fun, but you know, I've heard people in my guild who've got it saying that, you know, the maze can take some time. A couple of hours, I think someone said. So I'm thinking, well, a couple of hours of artifact power grinding in world quests would do me more good than getting a mount that I wouldn't even use because it doesn't even look good. So, I mean, I do generally like getting mounts that are attached to content that I do, which is like raiding and stuff like that. But not so much other ones like that. I mean, I may do at some point, but equally I may not. Because quite a few interesting mounts in Legion. But yeah, it's a bit like in WoD. You had quite a few mounts that came from like rares or had chances to drop from rares, but at no point did I put a lot of effort into getting them. Add-on for the maze. Wouldn't that just be boring? If you get a puzzle, isn't it boring to use an add-on? I mean, I'm not against people using add-ons, obviously. But surely that's just taking away the point of it. So if I were to do it, I would wait until I've got the time to do it. I would quite like them to think about increasing mounted, well, at least flying movement speed. The thing is, now that they've moved into this situation where flying is only available halfway through an expansion or partway through an expansion. So, and you've also got to do all your explanations to get it as well. You're really at the point where you just want travel to be quick. In which case, I don't see the harm in upping the flying mounted speed a bit higher. Maybe an extra 100% or something. I don't particularly want my dragons to have reduced ground speed. Occasionally you need the ground speed. But I would certainly like, you know, I don't think they would distinguish between types of mount anymore. They used to, but I don't think they would anymore. So there will just be a flying speed, max flying speed. But I would quite like it if they were to update. Excuse me. Oh dear, hiccups again. I would quite like it if they updated that and made it a bit faster now. Just because, like I said, by the time you get flying in the game now, traveling is just a chore. You've done everything. You have done all the content. You're just doing the daily stuff, the world quests essentially. That's what you use your mount for. Either to fly around gathering resources or to do world quests. Or I suppose get into a dungeon. But there's loads and loads of for mounts on Argus, isn't there? There's quite a few just for rep, when you get rep. The Vindicar port about an Argus becomes a feature. I don't see them ever doing that. I mean, it is quite nice. No, the actual taxiing is quite nice at the start of an expansion because you get to see the terrain, which you yourself can't fly over just yet. But I think the reason they did that on Argus, I enjoy the Instaport. Who doesn't at this point of the expansion? I think there's two reasons for the Instaports. One is that if there were a normal flying system with, it wouldn't be Griffins, I suppose, it'd be something else, then people would start to say, why don't we have flying on Argus? It would remind them that they don't have flying on Argus and would hassle. But the other thing is, I think directly linked to it, because I don't think they've ever intended to have flying on Argus, I think the zones are totally unsuited to it. I think the reason why we're porting around on Argus is because they haven't even done enough detail in the zones to allow a taxied flight. I think we'd see glitches in some of the scenery, is my personal opinion. I don't think it's technically even possible to fly on Argus. Like, let's say people went mad at them, just like they went on WoD. Obviously, when they said there's no more flying ever again in WoD, people went absolutely mad, and Blizzard had to backtrack on it. And even then, bear in mind, it still took them some time to be able to give us flying, because they had to remake, not like completely from scratch, obviously, but they had to remake some aspects of the zones to allow for flying, because there's all sorts of things that you don't, if you don't ever go over it, it doesn't matter. Or if you never, even on a taxied flight, you can use like graphical illusions and sticking plaster if you're never actually going to land on top of that mountain or something. I think Argus isn't even like that. I don't think it's, you know, they've done 3 zones. They must have done them fairly quickly. I think they're just quick jobs that wouldn't stand up to the scrutiny of even, as I say, a taxied flight over it. So let's say Mike Morheim was to come down on them and say, I insist that you allow flying on Argus. I don't think they could do it until the next expansion was nearly out, because I think they probably would have to do it all from scratch. Is my strong suspicion at any rate. And I think that's the reason for the teleporting. So that you know, it allowed them to just do a basic job of the zones and still make them look quite good. Because there's so much just art, like 2D art in the Argus zones. So they can't let you just go wandering around in air. Oh, Falling Flame works in Argus, does it? I didn't know that. I suppose you could try it in a few places. It would not surprise me if people were determinedly trying that they would find some bits where they end up falling through the world, though. Because you wouldn't necessarily know instantly which bits are... The other thing as well is you can't... The actual 3 zones are not directly connected either. So you wouldn't actually be able to physically travel from one to the other. Oh. Let people try to fly, then get shot down by the Legion. It might not make storyline sense once we've actually defeated the Legion. It'll be interesting to notice storyline-wise if there's even any demons left on Argus. I mean, there'd be demons left in the universe still. But whether they'd be kicked off Argus completely or not, I don't know. Would they try and do like a Plague Lands type thing, where they do a renewed Argus? Unable. Well, we do, but that's because, like, when you're on the Broken Isles, the chronology is of a time when that invasion is still going on. Whereas if they were to let us try flying on Argus, that would presumably have to come with the next patch, which is when the raid's out. Well, we can only infer so many details. All we've got of the raid is obviously the nature of the bosses and some data mined dialogue, but there was no suggestion in that data mined stuff that it goes boom as such. But what you don't see is what's in the cinematics. The cinematics may add something, as indeed the cinematics so far have added, because like no one expected the Illidan Zera thing, even though when you did it on the PTR, you know, you did a certain bit, you rescued Zera, and then you went back and Illidan was on his knees and Turalyon stood over him, and there was bits of Naru all over the place. So something has happened. You sort of knew something had happened, but you didn't know what. Do I think they'll change their stance on flying the next expansion? No. Because there hasn't been... I think a lot of people are quite happy. I mean, I personally am happy with the compromise. A lot of people are quite happy with the compromise. You don't have to call any such thing in Mahal. We already know exactly what happens. just from the dialogue and the nature of the fight, what's already in the raid journal on what the fights are about. Plus, as I say, the dialogue that's in the raid files has been data mined quite a while ago. And that includes all the dialogue that's mentioned just before the last boss and even when you've defeated the last boss. But no, I think obviously it's really difficult to say with expansions because they always bring in new features. But one thing we know is the developers do not want flying in the game, but they know they have to have it. So this idea of bringing it out a couple of patches in, like major patches in, seems to be a good compromise. They haven't faced a backlash for doing that. No one has, or not enough people, shall I say, have gone, oh no, what we want is want it on level cap. If people did do that, I suppose they would, but you know, I think it's fine, and most people are fine with it as it is. And I do quite like it because I think it must be quite bad for people that design the zones. Like, what is the point in putting lots of intricate detail in and doing lots of quests that require you to properly explore if all you have to do is get to level cap and go flying to all the different points? So it does take some interest out. I just wish that they would have more interesting ways of getting about instead of it just being jumping, riding or flying. You know, have but proper grappling, not like in Stormhound. That's a nice start. If that was, you know, just testing things out, but have a grappling thing where you can actually fire a grapple properly. And I'm not saying onto absolutely anything, but like cliffs and stuff like that, at least you can actually get up that way. You know, have a maximum range on it and things like that. They don't have to go for super accurate physics. Obviously, you know, it wants to be okay. I mean, at the point where you have a game where your weapon will clip with your cloak, we don't worry about imperfect physics. To say nothing of what they've done to Argus. Absolutely nothing. Well, that's fine for jumping down. It doesn't really get you up. I mean, you would still bubble jump down anyway because it's faster. Paladins get down cliffs faster than anyone. But we just can't get up them at all unless we can fly. I mean, even a little bit of climbing over a short distance would be better. I mean, the other thing, I haven't actually, have I done it on live? I have done it on live. There's the anchor thing as well, isn't there? I talked about that in the PTR. I've just done the quest for that too, as well. I haven't made myself any anchors in live yet, though. Oh, I see, sorry. But yeah, as I say, the next expansion, if it do, obviously they're not going to have, if they have any underwater zones, it's not going to be all of them. I still think that if they have any, it will just be one because I think it's a bit of a risk. It's a bit of a pain in the arse, but it might be interesting to see if they've actually done more suitable physics with an underwater zone. Because, I mean, there will be some new technology for something. Every expansion, there always seems to be something new on the technical side of things. I'm flying for a reason. Well, I mean, they could have just put the reasons in. And they didn't. Like, they obviously, for TBC, it made sense because of Outland. Sure, you have flying. Then for Wrath, they put some effort in, like you say there, because they created areas that you weren't going to get to without flying. But then after that, they just didn't seem to bother. They just created their zones and just had flying in anyway. Vashir, I absolutely hated it. I used to do it when I did it on my main character. I did the whole thing, of course, just for the sake of the storyline. But on then future characters, I only ever used to do it far enough to get the seahorse, and then I buggered off. I haven't done the artifact fishing pole yet. Again, I should do that. There's so many things in Legion I probably should do. But even if it's out for another year, whether I'll actually get them done is another matter. But no, I was really pleased you didn't have to do, apart from the very start of Vashir, because you did have to do that. But I was very pleased that you could just go to Hyjal and just do that instead. Yes, but that was, yeah, I mean, that was just for raids. And of course, there was Deep Home where you needed flying, which is why you could have flying without even getting to level cap. But Deep Home itself is not a terribly interesting zone. And then what came after that? Mop. Was there much in Mop? It was a lot easier, obviously, to get to Mogashan Vaults with flying. There was another way to. There was a way to get to it without flying, but that was a pain in the ass, I suppose. But and obviously you could miss out a load of mobs. There were massive numbers of mobs in the way of Heart of Fear if you didn't have flying. But I think it was more convenience in Mob than anything. And then in WoD, it was definitely WoD because they designed it without flying in mind. They were thinking when they were designing it, no, we're not going to have any flying ever. Finished. They just didn't bother to tell us during WoD Alpha. Otherwise, they could have saved themselves some grief because people would have gone mad at that point and they'd have realised just how strong the feeling was, and they'd have made sure that from an earlier point they could have it. Even though, as I say, I understand what their reasons are for not wanting flying. I sort of sympathise with them. But once you've had something in the game for so long, then that's it. It's the same as Legendaries. I don't know what their personal view is on Legendaries. But my view as a developer would be, do you know what, we couldn't have to do with not having Legendaries at all. But they're in the game, so it's just there. Well, certainly, Mahal, it is probably very frustrating for people, yes, that you've got... I mean, when did flying come in? It was 7. Was it 7.2 when flying came in Legion? It was, wasn't it? Because you had to explore the Broken Shore as the final bit, didn't you? So 7.2, and then, as you quite rightly say, 7.3 comes out, and all of a sudden you're not flying anymore. It's gone. You had it for one patch, basically. Well, like I say, their reasoning will be that you cannot possibly explore all the stuff they've spent a lot of time on while leveling. And it will take some people 8 months. Some people won't even have done it after 8 months. Which is why they don't just introduce it with a patch, they also make sure that you have to have done certain achievements as well. Because they want you to have experienced it all. At least on one character. Well, Shaman, the colour trinkets to have orange frame. I mean, I did suggest, I keep suggesting actually, that because the philosophy around the design of the new legendaries seems to be exactly the same as the design around trinkets, as has been for many years, that I don't see the point in having both. I would just have them as one thing. So combine trinkets and legendaries. So you don't have trinkets at all. You have 2 trinket slots, and all trinkets are legendaries, which you get as random drops like now. That would possibly work. It wouldn't cause all this grief over, oh, but that stops me using that set bonus or something like that. It would just allow you to have, you know, you get your legendaries, use whatever you are, you two-bis legendaries for that particular situation, and they go into those special slots, which are only for them, nothing else goes in them, all sorted. I think there's probably a lot of discussion about what is needed for an MMO. I mean, I certainly think they should put more effort into encouraging people to play, not just when an expansion comes out, but at any time throughout it. Old school glyph. What, instead of what? Well, you can't do it instead of legendaries because people want legendaries. It is very similar in some ways, but the thing is, people, you have to have legendaries. Like when I say combine the concepts of trinkets and legendaries, that could in theory just mean you get rid of the legendary system and you just say you've incorporated it into trinkets and make all trinkets really powerful and high item level. But people would say, well, you haven't got, even, you know, they're not legendaries. You have to have orange things that are called legendary in the game. It has to be. You can change how we acquire them. You can, you know, you can change the number of them, as of course they have, but you have to have them. It's like flying. If flying had never been brought into the game, no one would be asking for flying now. People don't ask for flying in other MMOs, or at least not in large numbers. Just like if there'd never been legendaries, then, you know, we wouldn't have them now. They wouldn't have been a new idea that someone thought, oh, what a good idea. We have them because historically they're just part of the fabric of the game now, Hazona. The colour-coded gear is a bit of a perplexing one now, I agree. But again, it's something that's been in the game. Like, you don't change something that's been in the game since day one. Anything that has survived till this point now is, well, in terms of gameplay anyway, is unlikely to be got rid of. Obviously, like, class abilities aren't included in that. We know they've done a couple of expansions of slash and burn on very iconic class abilities, so they're up for grabs. But in terms of features of the game, anything that's been in since day one, I think, is now part of it. But I mean, the bottom line is that that we are going to have legendaries in a similar vein to how we have them now. They will refine it. They'll change it. It won't be exactly the same. It might be the same way we get them, but the nature of the legendaries will have changed a bit. We won't be able to say how until they start showcasing them to us, which even then we don't actually know, because I'm trying to think now. Oh, I haven't got them on this computer. I remember some of the legendaries they showcased at BlizzCon when they were first, well, when they were announcing Legion before the alpha came out. One of them was actually the ring, the Ret Paladin ring that gives extra holy power. One of them was the leather boots that gives healing when you stand still. I don't think what another one was. I don't remember. But it was, yeah, I don't know what impression they were giving at the time as to how powerful they would be. Can't remember what I quite thought of them. But at the time, we didn't expect there to be absolutely loads of them. When is Legion calculated to end? I don't know. I can't think it would be the beginning of next summer. Because even if it would be ready by then, which is possible, the next expansion, if after 12 years they have never brought out a new expansion when I am off, like in outside term time. They're not about to start now. And although I don't pretend to understand all the ins and outs of when is a good time for a new game or a new expansion to launch and when is not, people are largely of the view that at the start of a summer break, or at least the start of a summer break for like students and things like that, which is a large part of the demographic that mainly plays World of Warcraft, that is not the ideal time at all. So they won't bring it out in, say, May, June or July. I think we can be fairly sure of that. Or almost certainly not August either. I'm trying to think of dates when they have brought it out before. I mean, obviously Legion came out on August the 30th. So I'll say August, but, you know, basically September. WoD came out in November-ish, was it? Mop, I think, came out in September. These are rough. I'm not exactly sure. Cataclysm, I wasn't playing at the start of Cataclysm, but I think that came out round about November, December. Wrath came out round about October, November time. I can't remember when TBC came out. Oh. I think it was early in the year, like January, February time. So you can sort of see they like to cluster them around autumn, winter. In other words, when people don't really want to go outside and play, should we say. They don't tend to bring these expansions out when it's nice clement weather outside. So, assuming the releases have never been completely random, I would say that you know, we can forget about a summer release. Summer is indeed the most difficult time to keep roster up for raiding. However, let's say they brought it out in July and didn't bring the raid out for a few weeks. Let's say instead of 2 weeks, it was 3 weeks or something, or even 4, but that might be pushing it, maybe 3 weeks. Well, then by that time, you might actually be okay. And remember, the first week of raiding is just heroic and normal anyway. So then that means you're not going into Mythic till September. That could actually sort of work out okay, maybe. But they will never do it. They won't do it because there's other reasons. It's not just about raiders. Casual players as well are obviously... They've clearly, if you look at it, kept away from sunny months. Sunny months, no expansion ever. And whether other, as I say, I'm not a student of games as such, so I don't know if other games companies do the similar sort of thing, but it wouldn't surprise me if they do. Well, obviously, yeah, there are always exceptions to this. There's no point in the year when people never go on holiday. But there are some points of the year when lots of people go on holiday. Like, for example, in Vanilla, the guild that I was in when we did like AQ40 and Nax, the previous summer when I wasn't a member of that guild, but we'd been told, because they were largely a Swedish guild, English was their like guild language, which is why I joined. But they had a lot of Swedes in it. And the previous summer they didn't raid at all because basically half their guild just, apparently it was a thing in Sweden, when it's summer they just bugger off outside. Trying to work out what that orange glowing thing in the sky is. And they don't come back till September. So that's why the following year they made sure to recruit a good number of people that were not Swedish so that they could raid through summer, which is when we killed Cthulhu, I think. A new expansion does require leveling gearing. But for, I mean, whatever reasons, because it's not all about raiders, remember. Raiders are at most, what, 10% of the player base? At most. So they'll base it on other people as well, but for whatever, it's not going to be summer. I mean, we can just say that because the odds are that there would have already been a summer expansion if indeed there was ever going to be. So it's going to, I mean, I would basically suggest probably September, because it can't be before September. Because because if you sort of think to themselves, they don't want to release it on, if it's the start of the year, probably January, February, March at the latest. Well, it's certainly not going to be ready for them. They don't want to release it between, say, April and August, so it's not going to be then, just because they don't want to release it those times. Again, this is just me assuming things. So September would be the earliest, and it would be doable by September. But they also can't leave it too late either. It couldn't. I don't think it could be left for as late as November, because then that would be too much time. Because remember, Antorus, even though it's expected not to be the last raid, but it is the last raid of that sort of size of raid. And we haven't had any other raid announced as yet. The intended lifetime of Antorus, if it comes out mid-November, which is when it's expected to come out, would be exhausted by March. So if you say that that content is exhausted by March and it doesn't come out till September, that's 6 months where they've got to put in new content. There has to be a 7.4 and a 7.4.5 at least. They have said there will be no more Ruby Sanctum type raid. They did. He clearly said that at Gamescom. He said there will be no more large raid, and he said there will be no Ruby Sanctum type raid, which people, myself included, have taken to mean a roughly, let's say, 4-ish boss fight raid. Sorry. Got to still deal with those old gods, yeah. Well, whether they do that in a 7.4 patch, or whether they do something else in 7.4 and leave that till the pre-expansion patch, I don't know. It is possible that 7.4 could be old gods related. I've never even been to Ruby Sanctum. I don't know how many bosses it was. I was just told that there was like one boss in it. Hellion or something, I don't even know. Never done it. I wasn't playing at the time it came out. I was taking my break from World of Warcraft at that time. And there was no interest in me doing it. Like when I came back, I mean, there was interest in doing like Ulduar and ICC, which were raids that I'd missed, because they dropped mounts and some nice transmog gear. Whereas the Ruby Sanctum, as far as I could tell, didn't drop anything. All of the old gods are still alive, apart from Yasharaj. All of them are alive. You cannot kill them. To kill them is to actually hurt Azeroth. So, even when we defeated, say, Cthulhu and Gordon Bennett. Help. What is it called in Ulduar? Yogg-Saron. Even when we defeated them, yeah, exactly. You weren't really... They're huge. They're massive. We were just like defeating their toenails, basically. So they're all still very much alive. We just... I mean, all you can say is we defeated them. We didn't kill them. You can't kill them. Not that they're unkillable, but to kill them is actually, like Amanthul discovered, to basically kill Azeroth. So they don't do that. Yes, exactly. What was that noise? What happened? Well, it was not from me, was it? I'm just having a look. Making sure. In fact, I'll close down my web pages. Well, not the Twitch one. Nothing else should be making a sound. Oh, okay, so it wasn't me then. Yasharaj, yes. Well, what happened with Yasharaj is Amanthul, who of course is quite big, basically grabbed down and ripped it out, and it created like a big wound. Imagine you gouge out a lump of flesh out of someone. So there's a huge wound there, which My mic has certainly not been pulled out. Sorry. Which they had to tend to, and it eventually became the Maelstrom. I mean, it was the Well of Eternity. That was the first stage. They created Titan constructs to look after it. The Keepers basically were the ones who were made to sort of look after things when they went away. But yeah, the Well of Eternity was basically a wound in Azeroth, like, and then of course after the Sundering, that became the Maelstrom. So they didn't really fancy doing it again because they sort of got away with it with one after a lot of fuss and emergency care. So yes, it was not an experience they wished to repeat. Because you don't sort of say when gouging out a lump of someone's flesh, oh, they survived that one, we'll do it to the others. Well, whether we even ever see it. I mean, the fact that it is a thing makes you wonder if they're intending at some point. But like I say, I always belly button. I mean, that's not a hugely violent wound because that's sort of expected. Your body sort of deals with that. He may be at the moment. I think Yasharaj was described as being the most powerful of them at the time. But I don't know. It's difficult to say, isn't it? Because it might be that their powers wax and wane according to, you know, how many of their followers are doing quite well at the moment. And it might well be that in the next expansion it is indeed N'Zoth. And it's very likely to be N'Zoth because, unless it's a complete red herring, which it could be, you have got those whispers from Il'gynoth. Whatever happened to the cart that Garrosh used, I don't know. It is potentially a good question. I'm sure it was covered in one of the novels. But as I say, I stopped reading the novels as soon as they kept retconning stuff to the point where it wasn't even worth doing anymore. Well, Yasharaj is in bits. I don't think they're going to bring him back somehow. Yeah, he was ripped into pieces. I don't think this is one of those you can raise them from the dead type things. There's no corpse, well, apart from bits that are sort of scattered all over the place. And his heart that fell back down as well and was pummeled. I think they're actually properly dead. They also, you think about it this way, why would the old gods want to bring the other one back? They're in competition with each other. Just because they're all fighting for the same thing, they are also in direct competition with each other. Well, I mean, its essence is in the heart, but you've got to remember there's no more power in it. Like, the whole point, and Blizzard were quite clear about this, Garrosh wasn't corrupted by the heart. He just used its power to grow like he did. But he was doing what he wanted to do. He wasn't. They made that really clear. He wasn't corrupted, and that's ultimately what the old gods are doing. That's their purpose. It's to corrupt things. So it's lost the power to corrupt. The Void Lords can indeed spew out more old gods, but the question is, do the Void Lords even know about Azeroth? Because they didn't target with the old gods, they just sent them out. It was literally like Empire Strikes Back with the probe droids, and then one of them happened across Hoth. This is the same sort of thing, only we don't know whether there's any link back. They were simply, all we know from Warcraft Chronicles is they were sent out, and where they did hit planets, if it was a Titan soul, they were to corrupt it. But we don't know if there's any communication back and forth. There may not be. So yeah, the Void Lords might have no idea whether or not any of them have been successful or not. No, I don't. I mean, in a fantasy game, anything can happen, but I don't think so. I think, one, they've given the impression that Yasharaj is gone completely. They've even shown in MOP that he doesn't have the power to corrupt anymore. So there's nothing there other than a bit of latent power, which Garrosh tapped into. That's all it was. It was just Garrosh tapping into it. And also, it's not in anyone's interest to bring him back. Who would want to bring him back? The other old gods don't want to bring him back because they're not collaborators. They're, they're not just trying to corrupt Azeroth. They're warring with each other. Their own followers war with each other. I would also like it. I would like it if I chopped someone's head off that they stayed dead. That would be quite nice. Perhaps we will get another troll raid, perhaps. I hope it's a bit more interesting this time, though, if they do. There is endless possibility for troll raids because trolls, of course, were the dominant life form on Azeroth at one time. So they have civilizations everywhere. So anywhere you can make a new zone for a new expansion, there are going to be some troll ruins if you want there to be. Alternative Draenor, exactly. That thing, I would like to think they have drawn a discreet veil over and we will never hear from it again. Never should have been done in the first place. Well, if they did scaling, leveling, scaling, and then they potentially easily could because people wouldn't have to do it. That being said, I wouldn't necessarily avoid it myself because I quite likes the WoD leveling. Am I out of focus? Gone back again. Because when I was going round I was getting some screenshots for a video, and I just remembered thinking I actually quite liked the leveling in WoD. I thought it was really good. In fact, it was probably my favourite expansion for the leveling experience. The leveling and the raiding were the only things they really got right. Cho'Gall. I mean, when he came in. Oh, so you mean Imperator Margok himself? Well, there's nothing hidden about that, I don't think. Basically, the Imperator Margok fight, as it went live, was very different to when we were testing it. So they were used during the testing thing. They decided it was too difficult. So so I don't think there's anything surreptitious about that. Like they were used in the testing, I seem to recall, and then they just chopped it out. So storyline wise, in terms of the intention, there was nothing hidden there to be brought back later, as far as I can tell anyway. But yeah, I mean, the storyline was that Cho'Gall wanted that power, yes. That's why he burst in like he did. In his ultra-corrupted form. Although, again, it's like... I don't know what was going on with Cho'Gall, though. There was an awful lot of anomalies. The first of which was this corruption thing. You look at him and go, oh, all old gods here. But that's because it was the same model they used for Cho'Gall that they had in Cataclysm, which was the only time Cho'Gall had appeared in World of Warcraft. There's no reason why Cho'Gall should have been in corrupted form in Warlords of Draenor if it was supposed to be alternate Cho'Gall. Because the Cho'Gall from our time at that time was just an ogre mage. He was a member of the Shadow Council, which he was supposed to be in WoD as well. So he's not supposed to have been corrupted by old gods. Apart from anything else, there's no old gods presence on Draenor. So I think it's just confused people by the fact that they couldn't be asked to make a new model of Cho'Gall. The only model they had of Cho'Gall at the time was the Cataclysm one, where he had been corrupted because he was on Azeroth. And joined the Twilight Cultists, and I think that's all there was to it. So I think it was just, yeah, it's a combination of laziness on that part and chopping out part of the encounter because it was too difficult and giving the impression that, you know, of something that wasn't actually intended. Oh, good. Seems we've got a new warlock for our guild. Assuming this one stays more than a day. I'm just trying to think what more range I want. I might be in the market for another mage. How many mages have we got? I lose track now. This summer has been... I mean, hopefully it's going to be a more stable time now over the next month or two because summer has finished. People will settle down and decide whether they're going to, you know, whatever. They'll settle down and decide whether they actually want to raid or not. We can start to get a bit more stability. But we still do have a couple of things. Warlock issues. Well, it's not warlock issues as such. I would just like more than one warlock. Has there been any word on new class? No, there hasn't been any word on anything apart about 7.3.5. The thing is, I don't think they can say anything just yet, because then people will be saying, well, if you knew about these problems, then why didn't you put them in 7.3? Obviously, there will still be class changes to come. When the Netherlight Crucible comes out next week, there's going to be hot fixes to rogues at least. Remember what they said? There were changes in the PTR to a few classes that didn't make it to 7.3, not because they were cancelled, but because, as Blizzard said, the reason for them is because it's the Netherlight Crucible which affects some classes better than others. So they're going to buff some specs next week. Why aren't locks played a lot? I'm not sure. It's the same with majors. I mean, on the one hand, I might think to myself, maybe it is just because they're not as much fun, or maybe they're more difficult. I don't know without having played them at any sort of level myself. But then you look at rogues as well. There are not very many rogues about. And I can accept that maybe subtlety has some tricks to it. If you don't, you know, you need to practice that a lot, I suppose, to get anything decent out of it. But assassination and combat, you can play at an acceptable level without very much practice. So I have no idea why there are not more rogues. So any sort of theory I have as to why maybe not mages and warlocks fall down instantly, because then I think, well, what's the reason for rogues? I don't know. I mean, for some people it might be annoying to change spec, but for a lot of people, if you play a pure DPS spec at a serious level, obviously at a casual level, play whatever you want, but at a serious level, you should expect to play all the specs, because that's normal. It's always been normal that you play whichever spec is going to be best, and that you might change that spec during a tier. Like one fight might be this, one fight might be another. Like, for example, Affliction has been very, very strong for a bit, but on File and Avatar, apparently Destruction is supposed to be better. Well, I think with some classes, it attracts certain type of people. So with rogues, it attracts pains in the arse. So they will tend to congregate in PvP type situations. But I still don't know why there are not more in PvE when it is, for at least two of the specs, straightforward to get decent results out of them. You know, any spec is difficult to play, to master, of course, but to get decent results out of them, and they're hugely desirable. You know, that should... I mean, obviously there are players like myself who choose... They play the spec, they play the class that they want to play, and they're not going to be tempted to play something just because it's really strong. But there's plenty of people who will want to play the strong spec. That's why you get loads of people asking for advice on what class to play. What class shall I play for this expansion? Well, the answer's always the same. Mage, Warlock, Hunter or Rogue, because you will always have a job. There is no fight where you will say, ugh, mages are a load of rubbish on this fight. Now, they may not be the best on a particular fight, but you will, if you've got good mages, you will always take them on every single fight. Same with all of those 4 classes, all of those pure DPS classes, because there's always a spec that's going to be good. Harder to get into groups. What sort of groups? Because it's not for guilds. To get into raiding guilds is not difficult as a rogue, because everyone, even when you have a fight where it's like, oh, melee are toxic here, that doesn't apply to rogues, because they get to choose so many mechanics. Dungeons might be a different thing. Even though rogues are a lot stronger now than they were, but they did suffer a while, and it may be that that perception is still there. But it shouldn't be, because rogues are now quite useful in dungeons. But for the raids, there really shouldn't be any objection to rogues, even if you're already what you call full on melee, because full on melee doesn't count for rogues. I mean, you think about Fallen Avatar. What did Method? Method had 7 melee, didn't they? And we had 8 yesterday, and that was too much. And it was like only 1 more than Method. What's going on? Well, Method had 5 rogues. That was a different kettle of fish. They had 5 rogues and 2 warriors, as I recall. So they're in a completely different. They're a completely different beast. But it's just baffling that they just aren't. They're not about. I have not managed to recruit and retain a rogue in this whole expansion. I think we recruited 1 rogue who then decided, like late on in Nighthold, who then decided he wanted to be a hunter for Tomb of Sargeras. I mean, who the hell goes from rogue to anything? Especially for Tomb of Sargeras, where rogues, if anything, were going to be even more useful. And well, he's even stopped playing now. Well, in theory, I would. I mean, if I'd have got my rogue up more, if I'd have thought about it more in advance and got my rogue higher item level, then I certainly would have been in last night instead of being on my paladin. That being, but you know. But I mean, that's why our Boomkin has gone rogue. I mean that just sort of demonstrates it. We have not got enough range for Final Avatar, and yet one of our ranged players is playing his rogue on it. Because, you know, it's like, in terms of the list of priorities for that fight, you've got melee at the bottom, then you've got ranged, then you've got a warrior or 2, and then you've got rogues. That's what you want. You want rogues. The squeaking. What's squeaking? But you certainly don't need 5 rogues now, because there's only 4 touches of Sargeras. But the thing is, when you say need, there's a difference between need and could bloody well use. Like, you don't need loads of rogues, sure. But it's not half-handy. Because if you've got the same people soaking everything, no one has to worry about when it's their turn to soak or anything like that, because it's always their turn to soak. So you still progress a lot faster if you have the ideal setup. And rogues are strong, not just because of the damage they do, because, you know, having the highest DPS classes becomes less important the further behind you are on progress, because even the poorer performing specs will do enough damage. But with rogues, it's their mechanical use. It's the fact that they get to ignore mechanics that makes them so beneficial. And whenever you've got soaking, they're generally a dab hand at that. There's the odd one where not. But generally speaking, they're pretty good at that. So they can solo soak all of the touches of Sargeras. I'm actually wondering if even our rogues are bothering to use cloak on any of them. Because they can't cloak they can cloak every second one and then feint in between. But then you might actually think that with some rogues, they might choose to just feint every single one and use Cloak of Shadows on Ruptured Realities or something like that. They can't use it on the Control Chaos, can they? Because I think that's specifically, I think that goes through Cloak of Shadows, if I recall. But anyway, yeah, but they're there for their mechanical benefits more than their damage, even though their damage is also pretty good. But ultimately, you're going to get most of your damage from your ranged, because, I mean, they can carry on DPS in. I mean, if Ruptured Realities comes in, not a problem. They're already out, or they should be. The only thing they have to move for, if they get daggers, they ought to move a bit. And if they get, they may have to move into the pylon if they're soaking that, but that's not, they're likely to position themselves near where they need to be anyway for that. It's just the chaos that comes in that they have to move for, and even then not for much. They don't have to move to get to the Maiden, to DPS that when necessary. They don't have to move to get, you know, they don't have to move far to get to their pylon. They don't have to move for Ruptured Realities if they're in the right place. They don't have to move for almost anything. And of course, they're not going to have to move for touch because that will be rogues soaking it, ideally. So yeah, whenever anyone asks me that, start of an expansion, which should I play? Some people always go, oh, well, you know, find one you enjoy. I just say, look, one of those four, whichever, if you enjoy playing any of those four, then play them. But just understand, if it's like one spec you really like and you don't like the other two, then try and play one where you're okay with all of the specs, because you never know which is going to be strong. And you can't be in a situation where you're only a one spec as a pure DPS class. Like, you get a lot of people that will say they're destruction warlocks. Like, no, we want a warlock, not a destruction warlock. Demonology warlocks are the worst, because by and large, most demonology warlocks are just DPS horse, because they like to use the excuse, oh, I'll lose a load of damage if I have to switch targets, so I'll better just tunnel the boss, hadn't I? Yes. But that's how you ensure that you will always be strong. Because it doesn't matter which is strongest, it's irrelevant. What matters is which is strong, which will always keep you in the raid. And as long as you can play all three specs. And keep them up, at least within striking distance. You don't have to keep them all at exactly the same level. Just keep them in striking distance so that if one... Because it won't be ever the case that one suddenly becomes stronger. There'll always be plenty of notice of it. Because you'll see it coming from PTR stuff. So that you'll always have a few weeks at least to switch stream. So just make sure that it's in touching distance, and then you can suddenly switch to it and focus on it, get your relics up, get your artifact power up if necessary, and then play that, but just make sure that you know how to play all of them. And it's baffling to me, the ones who don't do that. Like, I would love to have another spec of Paladin, DPS spec that is. I would absolutely make sure I could play both. Maybe they could make like do a reverse, well, not a reverse, like they did with Warriors. I know it was a bit of a clumsy way. It was just like one talent, which isn't very good. They had the Gladiator stance. If they did like something with Paladins, sword and board spec, could even be Shockadin. It could be more holy related. I'd be okay with that. Or even protection based. Just a DPS spec, another DPS spec. Preferably ranged, but even if it wasn't ranged, I would be okay with it. And I would be quite happy to sort of keep up with that personally. Legendaries can be an issue, of course. That is the big limiting factor in this expansion. But for a lot of people, that's not that, you know, a lot. If they've played from the start, obviously, and they've done a decent amount of content, they will generally have quite a lot of the legendaries. I mean, what have I got? I've got all my Retribution legendaries, which will, of course, include the general legendaries, which are common to all specs. I also have... What are my other ones? I got a Holy Legendary this week, so I've got at least one Holy Legendary. And I've got at least 2 Protection Legendaries as well. So I've got all the Ret Legendaries, all the General Legendaries, as well as 3 other off-spec Legendaries. It was a significant issue. But I don't know. There were people who still... It was a problem, because I know some people suffered, especially in Emerald Nightmare, which is a bit silly, really. But that was usually short-sighted. Because unless you're in like the top guilds, and even they would just make several of the same character, and whoever got lucky with Legendaries used that one. But a lot of the other ones, just they made do, and it was fine. Because the nature of the raids wasn't challenging enough for it to make that big of a difference at the time. By the time it was making a bigger difference in Nighthold, most people had the legendaries they needed. But of course you had to make sure you were doing your raids, doing your Mythic Pluses, at least a reasonable amount, doing your Emissary Caches, all the usual stuff that gave it. Whether that will improve in the next expansion or not, I don't know. It all depends on whether they perceive that as an issue. I hope they would, because for me, currently it's the biggest major issue. The other issues are not huge. In terms of, say, re-rolling or changing spec, there isn't really a serious barrier, potentially, other than legendaries. But even, as I say, even if there were, like, the amount of notice you get, like, if you've still got legendaries to collect, if you switch the spec it is, I mean, there's a good month or more when you know that for the next patch or the next raid or whatever, that there's going to be a spec going to be good. So it gives you time to actually just switch to that spec and try and get them. I mean, it's not guaranteed, but you've got a reasonable chance. Especially now when you've got so many legendaries already. AP is more, it's time that's the major barrier. Like, for example, if I was still off now, I would easily be able to get my artifact up to the level going to be required by the guild for next week. No problem at all. I mean, so that's dependent on the time you have to do it. Because if you can do obviously you do all your emissary caches, but if you also do all the world quests, you know, with a follower that has the token that can give you extra AP, or at the very least all the world quests that give AP, if you do not only some Mythic Plus dungeons, but if you go through all the Mythic baseline, the Mythic Plus 0 dungeons, that gives a decent amount of AP. You do like your daily heroic dungeon. If you make sure you do your raids, all the raid bosses that can give you AP, which is a lot of LFR, I should think. You can get quite a lot, and obviously the Argus World Quests give a lot. But a lot of people, of course, don't have the time to do all of that. So it's really more to do with time. See you later. I'm sort of, it's just roundabout time to finish anyway. I do the usual thing though, I'm not just suddenly disappear. I'll give it like a few minutes to see if anyone else wants to throw anything in. What's our guild's requirement? That next week that we are at 63. And I think it'll be 1 artifact level every week after that. But we play it by ear. I strongly suspect that we'd be hoping that people would be at round about 75 for Antorus. Hopefully that would be... Obviously how easy that is depends on now how quickly this artifact knowledge is ramping up, because I don't know anymore. Because I was expecting to get the next one tomorrow. We got it yesterday. So does that mean it's every 5 days, or does it mean they're just having it on a fixed day for EU and North America? Pass on that one. But at the moment, our requirements are 63 for next week. Which, of course, I have no chance on. I might be able to get within striking distance of it. If I can get more. I mean, I'm going to go off in a couple of minutes and do more world quests. Get myself onto Argus. But at the same time, I'm also rammed with work at the moment. Absolutely up to my eyes in it. Like I had to today do an email. Yeah, that's what I mean. It's appeared on the same day for both North America and EU, when you got the first one on the reset day last week. So that meant Tuesday for North America and Wednesday for Europe. So what do you get from 63 in the Crucible? You get 2 of the middle extra abilities. So 2 of your relics will have the extra abilities. That's assuming that it ends up being a good one. Because there are some good ones and there are some not so good ones. Does the eye level of the relic you put into the Crucible matter? Not for what abilities it gets, no. The eye level of the relic only affects the item level of your weapon. It doesn't affect any of the traits or spells. It doesn't affect the effect. No, it doesn't have any effect. The eye level is purely there for the weapon. So any of your spells that are based on weapon damage are affected by eye level of the relic. And that's it. Nothing at all about the extra abilities on the relic are affected by it. As far as I can tell. But I'm 99% sure of that. Yes. 4th, 5th, 6th relic. No, you've still only got 3 relics. Not sure what you mean by that. But your weapons will be getting more. When the Netherlight Crucible comes out, the first thing you will do is you will, if you've done all the storyline up to that point, which you will have done, then you just trot along, you complete the quest, and then go to the Netherlight Crucible, and you will instantly, no matter what your item level, your artifact level is at the moment, or at that time I should say, you will just be able to hit the first row. There's 3 rows of extra abilities. The first row is just bunging it up by 5 item levels, so you will just be able to click on that on every single relic, no problem. But then, for the second tier of abilities, you need artifact level 60 to access the first relic, 63 for the second, and 66 for the third. And then to access the extra traits, which is on the bottom tier, you need 69 for the first, 72 for the second, and 75 for the third. The 3 in the cruise, the 3, that's just the same relics you've got. You just, it's, I mean, you don't put them into the crucible as such. You don't put relics in the crucible. You just click on the crucible and the relics that are in your weapon just show up. Yeah, but what that trait is doing is increasing the item level of your relics that are slotted in your weapon. And then you have a fourth slot to put one in speculatively just to see what it's like, to decide whether you want to slot it into your weapon or not. Yes. I mean, you don't actually slot anything into the Netherite Crucible at all. You just right-click it and it comes up. The only things you just then click on the abilities like talents. So you're not actually putting relics into it. They're already in your weapon. As I say, apart from the fourth one in the top right-hand corner that you can slot relics into, but it's just to have a look at them before you decide whether or not to put it into your weapon. But once you do that, you bind it to yours. If it wasn't already bound, it becomes bound to you. So you can't then trade it to someone else if it turns out to be a bit rubbish. But anyway, so that'll be that. I will... I mean, we'll be able to talk a bit more about that. Unfortunately, not next week because it's still... Well, I suppose it'll be out in North America, so that'll probably crop up again next week, won't it? But I'll call that a day there. Thanks for coming. And until next time, I will see you later. I'm going to get off and do some work now. No, I'm going to get off and do some world quests now. Then I will get some work done. Bye-bye.